We shall continue with our second briefer, Ms. Emily Schaeffer Omer-Man. Ms. Omer-Man is a human rights litigator with over a decade of practice in the Israeli legal system. Her particular focus is on the challenging policies and practices of the occupation and representing human rights defenders denied access to Israel and Palestine. Her experience includes in bringing litigation primarily before the Israeli High Court of Justice, challenging aspects of the occupation under Israeli and international law. You have the floor, Madam.
Good afternoon, Madam Minister, Mr. Minister, Your Excellencies, and thank you to the sponsors of this meeting for giving me the honor to present to you today. Allow me to begin with a short story. Last Friday, I spent all day and night at a police station in an Israeli settlement just outside the Palestinian city of Hebron. I was there representing 17 Jewish American, Israeli, and Palestinian activists and local residents who had been violently arrested for attempting a humanitarian act of solidarity, repairing a dirt road that 5 Palestinian communities rely on for access to food, water, education, and medical care. These human rights defenders were there at the invitation of the Palestinian residents of one of those villages, Bir al-Eid, because the Israeli army has forbidden them to repair, not to mention pave, their road. Just a few hundred meters from Bir al-Eid is an Israeli settlement, one that even the Israeli authorities consider illegal. Yet, as is regular practice for the 100 unauthorized settlement outposts across the West Bank, Israeli authorities provide it with electricity, water, paved roads, and round-the-clock security, all of which the residents of Bir al-Eid lack. Bir al-Eid is a community that was forced off its land by repeated and unbridled attacks against the residents and their livestock by neighboring settlers, at times with the backing of the Israeli army, the body obligated under international humanitarian law to ensure the safety of the occupied Palestinian population. These same violent tactics led the access road to become closed to Palestinian use, open only to Israelis. Only after the village residents filed a petition to the Israeli Supreme Court did the army allow the residents to return to their homes and use this road. Yet they continue to endure regular harassment and abuse by settlers and Israeli security personnel. And although they are allowed to remain on the land, they are forbidden from expanding by even one tent or outhouse, or making changes to their access road, including essential repairs. I'm telling you this story because it is illustrative of the phenomenon that I want to speak with you about today. Firstly, I hope to explain what the process and not only the result of annexation actually looks like, both legally and practically. Secondly, I will discuss the barriers and unintended consequences of challenging that annexation in Israeli courts. And lastly, I will explain not only what you, leaders of the international community, can do, but why you have a responsibility and an obligation to take meaningful steps to avoid the dangerous path ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, this may sound counterintuitive, but the dire warnings we have heard in recent months about impending Israeli annexation of the Palestinian territory are in many ways a red herring. Far more pressing for this Honorable Council, the international community, and Palestinian stakeholders is the slow, quiet, or creeping annexation that has been underway for years. What is annexation? Simply put, it means the unilateral assertion of sovereignty over a foreign territory. It is also a major breach of the laws of war and of the United Nations Charter. We don't have to speculate about Israel's intentions in this regard. As recently as last month, Israel's Prime Minister stated unequivocally that he intends for Israeli military control over the West Bank to be permanent, and that he will begin applying Israeli civilian law to parts of that territory. Let us remember that every step that makes the occupation more permanent and less reversible is a paving stone of annexation. The process of annexation plays out in two ways. The first is the direct pressure placed on Palestinian communities to leave territory Israel wants for itself. As I mentioned, the threat of Israeli Supreme Court intervention halted the army's attempt to permanently displace the villagers of Bir el-Eid. But in the years since, Israeli policy, like in countless other Palestinian rural communities, has simply been to make life increasingly unbearable and even unlivable, with the hope of driving them out. This is the quiet deportation, happening to communities all around the West Bank. And its goal is to capture the maximum amount of land with the minimum amount of Palestinians. At the same time, the establishment and expansion of Israeli settlements like Mitzpeh Yair, which overlooks Bir el-Eid, and which is partly built on Palestinian private land, create facts on the ground that with each passing day are harder to reverse. It is crucial to emphasize that the damage caused by the settlements is not just the land they usurp. Each settlement has a ripple effect on the surrounding Palestinian communities. Beyond the well-documented physical settler violence Palestinians systematically face, often while soldiers stand idly by, settlements serve as a hub of structural violence, expanding into so-called security zones that rob Palestinians of access to natural resources and sources of livelihood, justifying restrictions on Palestinian development, and leading to countless constraints on free movement. The result is an alteration of the map, physically and demographically, and the disappearance of a contiguous Palestinian territory. This is the silent annexation that has been taking place for decades. Simultaneously, in recent years, we have seen a string of efforts by the Israeli government and courts to abandon the occupation law framework in favor of normalizing the application of Israeli law in the West Bank, which we can call the creeping legal annexation. The most obvious attempt is the so-called regularization law, which retroactively legalizes under Israeli law the confiscation of private Palestinian land for a large set of unofficial settlements in the West Bank, like Mitzpeh Yair. This law is not only a blatant violation of Palestinian property rights, it also represents the first in a line of laws legislated by the Knesset that apply not only personally to Israelis on both sides of the Green Line, as has been the practice since the start of the occupation, but now also territorially to the West Bank, in patent contravention of international law. More banal changes to income tax laws, labor law, and higher education bodies achieve the same result with less fanfare. Likewise, a recent Knesset directive requires that all new Israeli laws include an explanation for how they should be applied to the West Bank, effectively extending their reach into occupied territory. These and other legal steps move us inch by inch closer to full extension of Israeli civilian law on at least part of the occupied Palestinian territory, a hallmark of de jure annexation. Beyond the geopolitical and legal consequences of extending Israeli law to the occupied Palestinian territory is the far simpler matter of democracy and two of its most important tenets: representation and accountability. Palestinian residents of the West Bank, unlike Israeli citizens living in the same territory, do not have any legitimate political avenues to influence or hold accountable the legislative body now regulating their day-to-day lives. That subverts the entire notion of a democratic Israeli government. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, while challenging these policies in Israeli courts serves an important purpose, first and foremost seeking relief for Palestinian victims, doing so will never be adequate on its own, and can at times even be harmful. The Israeli Supreme Court has historically played a salient role in both the restraint and perpetuation of the occupation. The court stopped the forcible displacement of Bir el-Eid, but it helped create the conditions for what I described as a systematic, quiet deportation. In Bil'in, the court agreed to move the separation wall and return some of the village's land. But in doing so, it legitimized the wall itself, and by extension, its de facto annexation of some 12% of the West Bank. The majority of settlement neighborhoods challenged in the Israeli courts were either retroactively legalized during years of court proceedings or evacuated only to be relocated to a nearby Palestinian hilltop. Numerous other victories in court over the years ultimately translated into losses on the ground, avoiding catastrophic outcomes in the short term while reinforcing the systems that prop up the occupation. And to be clear, the scope of those legal challenges is already extremely limited. For the past quarter century, the Israeli Supreme Court has held that the legality of settlements under international law is a political question and therefore non-justiciable. Given that the political echelon has stated unequivocally not only that it is uninterested in ending the occupation, but that it plans to use judicial, legislative, and other means to make it permanent, the Israeli courts cannot be seen as an adequate remedy for preventing annexation and achieving Palestinian rights. These matters are not only of concern to Israelis and Palestinians. They have the potential to echo around the globe. Israeli interpretations of the international laws of occupation and of IHL generally set precedents for what legal standards will be applied in other occupations and armed conflicts around the world. Israeli jurisprudence and the actions it authorizes contribute to the establishment of accepted state practice and customary international law, and to the body of judicial decisions that inform the outcomes in other foreign and international tribunals. Ladies and gentlemen, I have spent over a decade litigating in the Israeli courts and administrative bodies representing Palestinian victims of violence committed by settlers and soldiers, challenging Israeli military policies that violate basic Palestinian rights, and defending Israeli, Palestinian, and foreign human rights defenders. Despite the tremendous efforts I and my many brave counterparts, Palestinian and Israeli alike, have made, as a collective, we are losing the overall struggle for equality and basic civil and human rights. We are failing in our efforts to stop the annexation. We are watching the possibility of Palestinian self-determination slip away, and we are running out of time. I have explained why the international community cannot wait for a declaration of de jure annexation before responding decisively. I've demonstrated why the Israeli legal system is inadequate for addressing both the myriad violations of human rights inherent in occupation and the threat of creeping annexation. And with the recent re-election of a leader who has consistently vowed not to end Israeli control over the Palestinian people and territories, it is clear, at least in the short term, that the Israeli political arena will not provide the catalyst for the change we urgently need. In conclusion, this Honorable Council and every member state of the United Nations must insist that settlements and annexation of any type are unacceptable. Individual states must do far more to make clear in every possible capacity the prohibition on annexation and all of its precursors. Those individual states must ensure that their own domestic legal systems are sufficiently robust to be capable and willing to enforce the law on their own corporate entities when they become complicit in human rights abuses and war crimes in the occupied territory. As the yet unpublished UN database of companies supporting Israeli settlements makes clear, too many foreign corporations are directly facilitating the occupation and the march toward annexation. These types of legal actions not only preserve the rule of law, they send an important signal about the international community's red lines. As an Israeli who cares deeply about my country and its future, I say to you, the Security Council of the United Nations, endowed with the cardinal task of protecting peace and security in the world, that protecting Palestinian human rights is not an anti-Israeli act. Criticizing Israel's policies does not equate opposing or even putting at risk its right to exist in peace and security. There will be neither peace nor security for Israelis or Palestinians without a major course correction. This body and all UN member states must employ their legal and diplomatic powers to ensure that the current course we are on does not become a permanent reality before it is too late. Today is Israeli Independence Day. While Israelis celebrate, however, the Israeli army has put the West Bank and Gaza under full closure. I look forward to the day when Palestinians and Israelis alike can enjoy and celebrate their own and each other's freedom, equality, self-determination, and independence. Thank you.
I thank you very much, Madam Omer-Man, for your courageous work as well as your insight that you have provided on the challenges facing the human rights authorities such as yourself. The fight is hard, but we need to remain steadfast in protecting the people deprived of their right in the occupied Palestinian territory. So once again, thank you very much.